What if no one interrogated you, and you still confessed anyway? What if the most damaging thing you said wasn't pressured, tricked, or forced, but volunteered freely out of confidence? Have you noticed how people talk more when they think they're safe, understood, or in control? And what happens when that feeling is completely wrong? In these moments, no questions are asked, no traps are set, and no pressure is applied. Conversations unfold normally until they quietly do all the work. Stay with us, because in these cases, undercover cops didn't extract information. People simply talked themselves into it. Today, we're opening the file on 45 dumbest things people said to undercover cops. Not because they were interrogated, threatened, or trapped, but because they misunderstood the situation they were in. These moments didn't unfold under pressure. They unfolded under comfort. Small talk turned into explanations. Explanations turned into details. And details appeared without being requested. The officers didn't push. They listened. What makes these moments remarkable isn't what was said, but how willingly it was offered when silence would have changed everything. Fasten your seatbelts, because in these cases, no one asked the wrong question. Confidence simply answered it anyway. 1. Don't worry, I know the law. The interaction began casually, with small talk that felt social rather than official. Trying to establish credibility, the person volunteered their understanding of the law and why certain actions technically didn't count. No legal clarification was requested, yet specific details surfaced naturally as part of the explanation. The undercover officer didn't correct anything. Confidence supplied the evidence on its own. 2. I've done this plenty of times before. In an attempt to appear experienced and trustworthy, the person casually referenced prior involvement in similar activities. The comment wasn't defensive. It was reassuring, meant to normalize the situation. Past actions became part of the present conversation without prompting. Familiarity replaced caution, and history introduced itself. 3. If you do it this way, it's not illegal. The conversation shifted into advice-giving, framed as helpful guidance between peers. The person explained how certain behaviors supposedly avoided legal consequences. The explanation required outlining actions, intent, and method. No interrogation occurred. The tutorial spoke for itself. 4. Cops usually don't care about this stuff. The statement was offered confidently, based on personal observation and assumptions. It was meant to lower tension and signal shared understanding. In doing so, it revealed expectations about enforcement and risk. Assumption turned into admission without resistance. 5. I'm just helping a friend out. Trying to distance themselves from responsibility, the person reframed involvement as minor assistance. Details were added to justify intent and minimize significance. Those details established participation more clearly than denial ever could. Explanation replaced silence, and silence was never challenged. So far, nothing dramatic has happened. No questions were pressed, no traps were sprung. The information appeared because confidence invited it into the room. And next, we move deeper, into moments where people didn't just talk to seem informed, but talked to seem connected. 6. You get it. You're not like other people. The conversation shifted when the person assumed shared values and mutual understanding. By positioning the undercover officer as different or more reasonable, they relaxed their guard. This attempt at connection led to expanded explanations meant to maintain rapport. Belonging invited disclosure without being asked. 7. Off the record, obviously. The phrase was offered casually, as if stating it created an invisible boundary. No agreement was made, but the assumption of privacy changed how openly the person spoke. Details followed that were never meant for documentation. The boundary existed only in the speaker's confidence. 8. I'm only saying this because I trust you. Trust was declared before it was earned, signaling emotional alignment rather than caution. The statement reframed disclosure as loyalty instead of risk. Once trust was announced, withholding information felt contradictory. The declaration unlocked its own consequences. 9. Between us, this happens all the time. Normalization became the strategy, suggesting routine rather than exception. The person described patterns and frequency to reduce perceived seriousness. Repetition transformed behavior into evidence. What felt ordinary became specific. 10. You'd do the same in my position. Empathy was assumed to close the social gap. By inviting agreement, the person justified choices aloud. That justification required clarity about actions and intent. Shared perspective replaced self-protection. At this point, nothing has been forced. Information flowed because connection felt safe. But safety often encourages explanation, and explanation carries details. Next, we move into moments where people tried to sound legally smart and ended up doing the opposite. 11. I know my rights, so I can say this. The person confidently referenced legal rights as reassurance while continuing to speak. The belief was that awareness itself created protection. Details were shared under the assumption that legality depended on phrasing rather than content. Knowledge became permission to talk. 12. I'm not admitting anything, just explaining. The statement framed the conversation as clarification, not confession. By separating intent from action verbally, the person felt insulated. The explanation filled in gaps no question had raised. Distinction without silence still counted as disclosure. 13. Hypothetically speaking. The conversation shifted into hypothetical language, meant to detach reality from words. Scenarios were described with remarkable specificity. The label changed, but the information didn't. The situation stayed real, even when the grammar didn't. 14. That's only illegal if you get caught. The remark was delivered casually, almost jokingly. It revealed assumptions about enforcement rather than legality. Intent surfaced through attitude, not admission. Perspective communicated more than facts. 15. I'm allowed to talk about this. Permission was assumed rather than confirmed. The belief that something could be discussed replaced caution about whether it should. Context was ignored in favor of confidence. Authorization existed only in the speaker's mind. So far, nothing has required pressure. The words arrived wrapped in confidence, trust, and misunderstood legality. And next, the tone shifts again, because calm often feels safest right before everything changes. 16. Relax, nothing's going to happen. The conversation carried an easy tone, reinforced by the belief that the situation was under control. By declaring safety out loud, the person reduced their own caution and continued speaking freely. Reassurance became permission to elaborate. Calm didn't prevent consequences, it invited detail. 17. If this were serious, I'd know. Confidence came from the absence of obvious warning signs. Because nothing felt urgent, the person assumed nothing was wrong. That assumption justified continued openness. Lack of alarm was mistaken for clearance. 18. I'm just being honest here. Honesty was framed as a social virtue rather than a strategic choice. The statement positioned openness as maturity and trustworthiness. Truth surfaced without considering audience or context. Integrity replaced discretion. 19. I don't have anything to hide. The phrase was meant to signal innocence and transparency. By rejecting the idea of concealment, the person dismissed the value of restraint. Information followed naturally to support the claim. Nothing hidden still meant everything said. 20. This is all pretty normal stuff. Normalization softened the moment, suggesting routine rather than exception. The person explained actions as common practice to reduce perceived risk. Routine required examples. Normality filled in the blanks. At this point, the pattern is unmistakable. No pressure, no urgency, no force, just comfort doing the work. But the next set shifts again, because sometimes people don't just feel calm, they feel clever. 21. I've thought this through very carefully. The statement was offered to establish control and foresight. By emphasizing planning, the person tried to project intelligence and responsibility. That explanation required outlining steps, timing, and decision-making. Preparation turned into a narrative no one requested. 22. There's actually a simple way around this. The tone shifted from casual to instructional, as if sharing a clever insight. Explaining the workaround required describing the problem it solved. Details emerged framed as ingenuity rather than exposure. Cleverness volunteered clarity. 23. Most people don't understand how this really works. Positioning oneself as informed created authority in the conversation. Correcting imagined misunderstandings required precise descriptions. Knowledge was demonstrated rather than protected. Expertise introduced specificity. 24. I've covered every angle. Confidence expanded into reassurance that nothing had been overlooked. To support the claim, the person reviewed contingencies aloud. Each safeguard described reduced uncertainty for the listener. Thoroughness mapped the entire situation. 25. I'm not worried about this at all. The declaration was meant to end suspicion and reinforce confidence. Instead, it removed the last reason to stay guarded. Calm confidence invited elaboration rather than closure. Lack of concern extended the conversation. By now, it's clear that talking wasn't driven by fear. It was driven by confidence. People didn't speak because they were pressured. They spoke because they wanted to sound informed, capable, and in control. And next, we move into the moments where humor and casual remarks quietly crossed the line. 26. I probably shouldn't be saying this, but the sentence was delivered with a laugh, signaling awareness without restraint. By acknowledging risk verbally, the person felt they had neutralized it. What followed was treated as humor rather than information. Self-awareness didn't stop disclosure. It framed it as harmless. 27. If this ever went wrong, it'd be funny. The remark rebranded potential consequences as hypothetical comedy. By joking about failure, the person minimized seriousness and continued talking. The humor required describing what going wrong would actually look like. Laughter filled in operational details. 28. You can't make this stuff up. The phrase was meant as storytelling flair, not evidence. To make the story land, the person added specificity and context. Narrative clarity replaced caution. Entertainment value introduced precision. 29. I'm only half joking. By labeling a statement as partly humorous, the speaker tested boundaries. The line invited curiosity rather than shutdown. Clarification followed to explain what part was real. The joke opened the door, the explanation walked through it. 30. You'll laugh when I tell you this. The setup framed the disclosure as shared amusement. Anticipating laughter created permission to continue. Details were delivered to earn the reaction. Comedy became a delivery system. At this stage, the pattern has fully shifted. Words aren't offered out of fear or confusion. They're offered for connection, humor, or validation. And next, the final escalation begins, where people try to explain themselves after realizing something might be wrong. 31. Wait, that's not what I meant. The moment uncertainty entered the conversation, the speaker sensed that something had shifted, even if they couldn't articulate why. Wanting to regain control, they attempted to correct their earlier statement, assuming clarification would restore safety. But clarification required repeating the original idea with more structure, more detail, and more intent attached to it. What was once ambiguous became defined, and what could have been dismissed as casual phrasing now existed as a clearly articulated position. The undercover officer didn't challenge the correction or ask for elaboration. The speaker provided it voluntarily. Backtracking didn't undo the statement, it sharpened it, transforming uncertainty into something far more usable than silence ever would have been. 32. Let me explain that better. This phrase usually appears when the speaker believes misunderstanding is the problem, not exposure. The assumption is that clearer language will reduce risk, when in reality, clarity often increases informational value. In explaining better, the speaker added context, sequence, motivation, and reasoning, elements that were never requested but felt necessary to justify the point. Each added layer reduced plausible ambiguity and replaced it with coherence. The undercover officer didn't interrupt or redirect because explanation was doing the work efficiently. What began as damage control quietly became organization, and organization made the information easier to understand, connect, and remember. 33. You're taking that out of context. The phrase signals discomfort without restraint. Rather than stopping, the speaker attempted to restore meaning by supplying missing background. That background included how the situation started, why certain choices were made, and what outcomes were expected. The goal was fairness, to make the statement sound reasonable again. But context doesn't erase information, it frames it. By restoring context, the speaker didn't weaken the original statement, they anchored it. The undercover officer didn't need to challenge the claim. The speaker built a full narrative themselves. Context turned a fragment into a complete picture. 34. That's not what it sounds like. This sentence acknowledges risk while resisting silence, which is precisely what makes it dangerous. To change how something sounds, the speaker attempted to redefine reality with additional explanation. That explanation included details meant to soften intent, reduce seriousness, or reframe involvement. Instead, it confirmed that the original interpretation was close enough to require defense. The undercover officer didn't respond with skepticism or reassurance. They listened. The act of reshaping perception required describing reality more precisely, and precision replaced ambiguity. The meaning didn't disappear, it stabilized. 35. I can clear this up right now. At this stage, the speaker believed decisiveness would resolve tension. Rather than pause, they accelerated, assuming that full transparency would eliminate suspicion. Clearing something up required completeness, timeline, intent, role, and outcome. Each element was presented confidently, as if thoroughness equaled safety. The undercover officer never asked for that level of detail. Completeness closed every remaining gap, leaving no room for reinterpretation. The attempt to resolve the situation didn't calm it, it finalized it. 36. I'm probably overthinking this. This sentence surfaced once the speaker felt a subtle mismatch between comfort and caution. Rather than stopping, they dismissed their own hesitation as unnecessary anxiety, framing continued talking as a way to appear relaxed and reasonable. By verbalizing the doubt, they also revealed awareness that something might be wrong, which reframed everything said afterward as conscious choice rather than accident. The attempt to downplay concern encouraged additional explanation, meant to prove there was nothing to worry about. The undercover officer didn't reassure or challenge the statement. They let the speaker resolve their own doubt out loud. Overthinking wasn't the issue, over-talking was. 37. This isn't a big deal, honestly. The speaker tried to control perception by reducing the perceived importance of the topic. Declaring something insignificant is often meant to close conversation, but it frequently does the opposite. To justify why it wasn't a big deal, the speaker supplied comparisons, examples, and scale, details that established relevance rather than eliminating it. The need to minimize introduced specificity, and specificity replaced vagueness. The undercover officer didn't dispute the claim. They allowed the speaker to support it themselves. Downplaying seriousness didn't shrink the situation. It defined its boundaries clearly. 38. I'm just talking hypothetically now. Once discomfort appeared, the speaker attempted to retreat into abstraction. By labeling the conversation hypothetical, they hoped to detach words from consequences. But hypothetical language still requires structure. Conditions, actions, and outcomes must be described for the scenario to make sense. The more coherent the hypothetical became, the less hypothetical it sounded. The undercover officer didn't correct the framing or ask follow-up questions. The speaker built a fully formed scenario on their own. Changing labels didn't change content. 39. I mean, if you really think about it, this phrase marked a shift from casual talk to rationalization. The speaker tried to slow the moment by reframing it as thoughtful analysis rather than spontaneous disclosure. In doing so, they articulated reasoning, justification, and internal logic that hadn't previously been stated. Thoughtfulness replaced restraint, and reflection became explanation. The undercover officer remained neutral because neutrality kept the reasoning flowing. Analysis turned implication into intention. 40. I should probably stop talking. The statement arrived as a realization rather than a decision. Instead of stopping immediately, the speaker explained why they should stop talking, summarizing what had already been said to contextualize the concern. That summary reinforced the very points that triggered hesitation. The undercover officer didn't interrupt the moment of awareness. The speaker narrated their own crossing of the line. Realization came, but it arrived after completion. 41. I didn't mean it like that. This sentence appeared once the speaker realized interpretation mattered more than intention. Rather than stopping, they attempted to reframe meaning by revisiting what they had already said, assuming intent could override impact. To explain how it was meant, they clarified motivations, boundaries, and reasoning that hadn't been explicit before. What started as a correction became an expanded version of the original statement, now richer in context and implication. The undercover officer didn't argue semantics or intent. Meaning stabilized not because it was challenged, but because it was fully explained by the person trying to escape it. 42. You know what I'm saying? The phrase was used to seek agreement and close ambiguity through shared understanding. By inviting confirmation, the speaker assumed alignment rather than uncertainty. To ensure that alignment existed, they restated their point more clearly, often simplifying and reinforcing it. The desire to be understood replaced the instinct to be cautious. The undercover officer didn't confirm or deny understanding. The speaker confirmed it for them. 43. I'm being completely straight with you. Honesty was declared as a signal of trust and maturity. The statement reframed disclosure as virtue rather than vulnerability. Once honesty was announced, withholding information felt contradictory to the image the speaker wanted to project. Details followed not because they were demanded, but because consistency required them. The undercover officer didn't respond with approval or skepticism. Integrity became the mechanism that delivered completeness. 44. I've already told you everything. This phrase arrived as a perceived endpoint, meant to signal closure. To justify that everything had been said, the speaker mentally reviewed what had already been shared and summarized it out loud. The recap organized scattered remarks into a coherent sequence. What had been fragmented now sounded intentional. The undercover officer didn't request a recap. Closure assembled the case for them. 45. So, yeah, that's basically it. The final statement carried relief, as if the conversation had safely concluded. It functioned as a wrap-up, turning scattered explanations into a finished narrative. By signaling completion, the speaker framed everything said as deliberate and complete. The undercover officer didn't add anything to the exchange. The conversation ended not with a question, but with a summary written by the person who should have stopped speaking first. When nobody asked, but everything was said. Looking back at all 45 moments together, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. None of these situations required interrogation. No pressure, no raised voices, no clever traps. In almost every case, the most damaging information appeared voluntarily, delivered through confidence, comfort, and the desire to be understood. People didn't speak because they were scared. They spoke because they felt safe. They assumed rapport, privacy, or shared perspective. They believed clarity would protect them. Honesty would humanize them. An explanation would resolve tension. Silence felt awkward. Talking felt productive. And confidence quietly replaced caution. What makes these moments unsettling isn't how foolish they sound, it's how ordinary they feel. Every phrase came from familiar instincts: to explain yourself, to be likable, to sound informed, to correct misunderstandings. None of these impulses are malicious, they're social. But when the situation isn't what you think it is, those same instincts become liabilities. Across all 45 examples, the undercover officers didn't need to extract information. They didn't need to push conversations forward. They simply allowed people to keep going. The words accumulated not because of deception, but because momentum favors speech. Once talking begins, stopping feels harder than continuing. These events aren't about intelligence or guilt. They're about context blindness. About how easily people assume control when the environment feels normal. About how quickly explanations turn into narratives and narratives turn into records. The most striking detail is this: in nearly every case, the moment of realization came after the conversation was complete. Silence arrived, but too late. Reality didn't force these confessions. Confidence delivered them. What makes these 45 moments uncomfortable isn't how outrageous they sound. It's how easily they could have been avoided without anyone doing anything differently, except stopping sooner. No traps were set, no pressure was applied, no clever questions were asked. The situations didn't escalate because of force. They escalated because conversation continued. In every case, the speaker believed they were managing the moment. They spoke to clarify, to connect, to appear honest, informed, or reasonable. Talking felt like participation. Silence felt suspicious. Explanation felt safer than restraint. And because the environment felt normal, the instinct to keep going overpowered the instinct to pause. What's striking is how little deception was required. Undercover officers didn't need to manipulate language or steer dialogue aggressively. They simply allowed social momentum to do what it always does. People filled gaps. They softened edges. They reframed statements. They summarized. They corrected themselves. And with every attempt to regain control, they surrendered more of it. These moments aren't about stupidity. They're about misread context. About assuming the conversation is social when it's informational. About believing intent matters more than content. About forgetting that words don't disappear just because they feel casual. Once spoken, they don't belong to the speaker anymore. Modern life trains people to talk, to explain, to justify, to narrate themselves in real time. Silence feels uncomfortable, even suspicious. But silence isn't emptiness, it's space. And space is where awareness lives. Without it, momentum takes over. The irony is that many of these people realized what was happening just seconds too late. The moment of hesitation arrived after the explanation was complete. The instinct to stop appeared only once there was nothing left to stop. Awareness came, but closure had already been written. These stories aren't warnings about law enforcement. They're reminders about human behavior, about how confidence creates confessions, about how safety is often assumed, not assessed, and about how the most damaging statements are rarely forced, they're volunteered. In the end, the lesson isn't say nothing. It's know when silence matters, because in these cases, the most powerful thing anyone could have said was nothing at all. This has been the Absurdist Files, where no one was interrogated, where logic stayed calm, and where reality proved once again that it doesn't need pressure to expose itself. Just a conversation that doesn't stop.